Good morning. Today we will look at the summary of the poem The Seasons by James Thomson. A cycle of 4 long poems of blank verse with a brief concluding hymn. The Seasons celebrates the magnificence and harmony of nature as a manifestation of the Supreme Being. It embodies literary, philosophical, and theological ideas. The characteristic of the 18th century, yet it also prefigures the Romantic movement of the 19th century, particularly in its depictions of storms and wilderness. It enjoyed extraordinary popularity and influence in both centuries, and its impressive, picturesque landscapes made it a favorite text for illustration. The poem evolved gradually, beginning with a short piece called Winter, published in 1726. As he expanded and revised the work, James Thomson adopted the Georgics circa 37 to 29 BCE, English translation 1589, of the ancient Roman poet Virgil as his literary model, finding there a precedent for his subject matter, that is nature, his 4-part structure, and his elevated style. Standing in the middle ground between the pastoral and the epic Georgic verse, was expected to use lofty diction in celebrating the earth's bounty. Whereas pastoral poetry uses nature artificially as stage scenery for the philosophizing of urbane shepherds, Georgic poetry draws inspiration from the noble labors of the farmer. Thomson by no means restricts himself to the farm, however. He seeks in untamed nature a special quality that fascinated his age: the sublime, the paradoxically uplifting experience of awe and even of terror. Each of the 4 poems opens with conventional elements, an invocation to the poet's muse, and an elegant address to his patron. Thereafter, each loosely adheres to a different structural principle. The first poem, Spring, celebrates the influence of the season over the whole chain of being, starting with the lowest, inanimate matter, and ending with the highest of beings on earth, which is man. Thomson prefers not to depict nature for its own sake, but to do so for what it teaches, and many of its glories become occasions for edifying digressions. Edifying means to give moral instruction, and digressions means to shift from the main subject and talk about something else instead. To continue, after describing the breezes warming the soil, the poet argues for the dignity of his theme, for agriculture crowns the British Empire as it once crowned the Roman Empire. Describing a rainbow after a spring shower, he contrasts the scientific theory of Sir Isaac Newton with the dumb amazement of the ignorant swain, that is the peasant, or the village youth. The thought of the virtues in herbs provokes a long discussion of humanity's lost innocence. In days of old, reason governed passion, and even the lion was gentle. But since the flood, afflictions have beset humanity. The flood is the flood mentioned in the Bible, where Noah's ark was made to float and humanity survived. Afflictions means disease, beset means attacked. Humanity is the human race. To continue again, yet humankind still neglects the wholesome herb and consumes or eats up the flesh of harmless animals. Some readers have criticized the looseness that results from this circuitous method, means going around in a very detailed manner. And no doubt, the long cumulative process of composition worked against the development of a rigid structure. But this lack of architecture reflects Thomson's sense of nature, for the poem possesses an underlying coherence that may be discerned only intermittently beneath the wonderful variety of the surface. Birds follow vegetation. The poem relates how, infused with love from the source of beings, they mate and build nests, brood over their eggs, and at last teach their offspring the art of flight. This springtime diffusion of amorous passions dominates the rest of the poem, but it refuses to conduct, out of respect for female readers, says the poet, a detailed discussion of animals, and gives rise instead to a lecture on the torments that befall youthful lovers and the happiness of those who join in marriage and bring forth a delightful human blossom. Moralizing or didactic verse of this kind, besides being sanctioned by Thomson's literary model, was considered to be an integral part of the topographical poem, in which an impressive landscape becomes the occasion for profound and edifying meditation. Indeed, the seasons inseparably intertwines description and didacticism. Didacticism means teaching something. James Thomson's The Season, 1730, is one of the earliest, longest, and finest natured poems in the English language. Written in blank verse and in its final form, some 5,500 lines long, the poem celebrates and explores the variety of nature, the increasing intelligence and warming sensibility of humans, and the power of God. Thomson treats each season in succession, describing the effects of changes in the solar system, weather, and landscape on the plants, crops, and inhabitants, human and otherwise, of various regions. He lingers over the rolling terrain of the Scottish border country where he grew up, and he paints the fertile, rural, agricultural landscape of England with an appreciative brush. James Thomson, who was a Scottish poet born in the year 1700 and died in 1748, His best verse foreshadowed some of the attitudes of the Romantic movement. His poetry also gave expression to the achievements of Newtonian science and to an England reaching toward great political power based on commercial and maritime expansion. In the Seasons, first published as a complete entity of 1730, but then massively revised and expanded until 1746, Thomson meditated upon and described with fascinated precision the phenomena of nature. He brought to the task a vast array of erudition, means learning, and a delighted absorption in the discoveries of post-Civil War science, especially Newtonian science, from whose vocabulary he borrowed freely. The image he developed of man's relationship to and cultivation of nature provided a buoyant portrait of the achieved civilization and wealth that ultimately derived from them, and that, in his judgment, a contemporary England enjoyed. The diction of the Seasons, which is written in blank verse, has many Miltonian echoes. In Castle of Indolence, 1748, Thomson's model is Spenserian, and it is wryly developed allegory lauds the virtues of industriousness and mercantile achievement. Because James Thomson's long reflective landscape poem The Seasons, 1730, as we remember, commanded so much of attention and affection for at least 100 years after he wrote it, his achievement has been identified with it. Thomson, however, was also a political figure through other poems and through some of his plays, standing strongly for a kind of republican ideal against what he saw as the vulpine individualism and oligarchic government of Robert Walpole. As a Scot who spent his adult life in England, he embodied in his work a comity between the two lands and traditions. Partly with these socio-political interests in mind, and partly to complement the sweep and poignancy of the Seasons, he wrote 5 tragedies and a patriotic masque of some distinction. Finally, his Spenserian allegory, The Castle of Indolence, 1748, stands as the finest in English other than Edmund Spenser's own. That's all for today. Thank you.